Welcome to the dark side of the podcasts. I'm your host, Scott, and I am not here to tell you what to think. I am going to tell you what I think. I won't tell you what happened, but I will tell you why it happened. Hope you enjoy our show, and as always, I can be reached directly at scott@thepodcast.com. So let's do this. Welcome to this edition of the Dark Side of the Podcasts. I have to tell you guys, I'm loving doing these videos. They're very therapeutic for me, and it's nice to hit some additional forums. For anyone watching who just wants to listen to the studio quality audio, you can find us on thepodcast.com or pretty much any of the major podcast players under The Podcasts, all one word. But if you really like watching me flail my arms about, I'm happy to have you here. We spent a bunch of money on the audio video gear, so we might as well get some use out of it. And if anyone does happen to watch this, if you hit the subscribe button, you will be the first one to do so. So this is a cherry-picked, I cherry-picked a version of a piece written by the Saker over at Zerohedge. And let me tell you, it was magnificent. I can't say I agree with all of the conclusions, but I can see them from where I'm standing. And boy, it's a good piece. So I'm just gonna get right into this one, okay? And to explain my point, I would like to begin by saying what I believe the riots we are seeing taking place in hundreds of U.S. cities are not about. They are not about racism or white privilege. They are not about police violence. They are not about social alienation and despair. They're not about poverty. They're not about Trump. They're not about the liberals pouring fuel on social fires, and they're not about the infighting of the U.S. elites and the deep state. They're not about any of these because they encompass all of these issues and more. It is important to always keep in mind the distinction between the concept of cause and pretext. And while it is true that all the factors listed above are real, at least to some degree, and without looking at the distinction between cause and effect, none of them are the true cause of what we are witnessing. All right. At most, the above are pretexts, triggers, if you want. But the real cause of what is taking place today is the systemic collapse of the U.S. society. The next thing which we must also keep in mind is that evidence of correlation is not evidence of causality. Take, for example, the article from CNN entitled U.S. Black-White Inequality in 6 Stark Charts, which completely conflates the two concepts, and which includes the following sentence. Those disparities exist because of a long history of policies that excluded and exploited Black Americans, said Valerie Wilson, director of the program on race, ethnicity, and the economy at the Economic Policy Institute, a left-leaning group. The word because clearly point to a causality, yet absolutely nothing in the article or data support this. The U.S. media is chock full of such conflations and correlation and causality, yet it is rarely denounced. For a society, any society, to function, a number of factors that make up the social contract need to be present. The exact list that made up these factors will depend on each individual country, but they would typically include some kind of social consensus, the acceptance by most people of the legitimacy of the government and its institutions, often a unifying ideology or, at least, common values, the presence of a stable middle class, the reasonable hope for a functioning social life, educational institutions, etc. Finally, and cynically, it always helps the ruling elites if they can provide enough circuses and bread to most citizens. This is even true of so-called authoritarian, totalitarian societies, which, contrary to the liberal myth, typically do enjoy the support of a large segment of the population. If only because these regimes are more often capable of providing for the basic needs of the society. You know, you take from everybody and you get what you get. Right now, I would argue that the U.S. government has almost completely lost its ability to deliver any of those factors or act to repair the broken social contract. In fact, what we can observe is the exact opposite. The U.S. society is highly divided, as is the U.S. ruling class. Not only that, but ever since the election of Trump, all the vociferous Trump haters have been undermining the legitimacy not only of Trump himself, but of the political system which made his election possible. This is an absolutely amazing phenomenon. while for almost 4 years, Trump has been destroying the U.S. empire externally, Trump haters spent the same 4 years destroying the U.S. from the inside. If we look past the largely fictional differences between the Republicrats and the Demolicans, we can see that they operate like a demolition tag team of sorts. And while they hate each other with a passion, they both contribute to bringing down both the empire and the United States. For anybody who has studied dialectics, this would be very predictable, but dialectics, they're not taught anymore. Hence the stunned deer in the headlines, look on the faces of most people today. And finally, it is pretty clear that for all its disclaimers about supporting only the peaceful protesters and its condemnation of the out-of-town looters, most of the U.S. media is completely unable to give a moral, ethical evaluation of what is taking place. And what I mean by this is the following. By repeating mantras about how black anger is legitimate, the U.S. liberal media is basically placing a seal of approval on the violence and looting. After all, if black anger is legitimate and if white privilege is real, then it is quite understandable that this anger sometimes boils over and leads to regrettable excesses. Just take a look at this. There was an image up there of Biden kneeling down before a black demonstrator. Of course, Biden and his supporters will claim that Biden was only kneeling before a cute little girl and her peacefully protesting father. But when combined with the attacks against Trump's law and order rhetoric by Biden and his supporters, including 4 former U.S. presidents, I believe that these kinds of photo ops are sending a very different message. Keep protesting, as we are on your side. Coming from a guy like Biden, the ultimate symbol of the 1%er elites and a perfect example of white privilege, just goes to show that the hypocrisy of U.S. politicians really knows no bounds or limits. So, look, this is not a revolution, all right, and it's not a civil war. Some people are now fantasizing that what we are witnessing today is either a revolution or a civil war. I believe that this is neither. For a revolution to take place, there must be a force capable of changing not the person in power, but fundamentally change the regime, the polity itself, and replacing it with another one. Declaring that Black Lives Matter, or looting stores, or even demanding that the police be defunded, it does not have this kind of potential capability. For a civil war to take place, you need at least 2 sides, each with a clearly identifiable political agenda. Since the real power in the U.S. is hidden from the public awareness, there is no potential for the people versus the rulers kind of civil war in the U.S. A right conservative versus left liberal civil war is also not possible because both the U.S. right and the U.S. left are, in reality, controlled by a deep state which is neither liberal nor conservative. And finally, a rematch between North and South is not possible either because the modern U.S. is not really split along North-South lines anymore. In terms of geography, there is somewhat of a big cities versus rural USA split, but it takes place in both the North and the South of the country. Instead, what we do observe is a social breakup of the U.S. into zones, some of which will be doing much better than the others. Big cities with a strong black population are going to fare the worst. Mostly white small towns are going to fare best. That's even true within the same state. Now, in some of these zones, we will see more of this kind acts of self-protection. All right. The confrontations, even if they are not violent, are yet another illustration of the state being simply unable to take charge and protect the people. This is an insurrection which has initiated the systemic collapse of the U.S. society. And I'll call what is happening today an insurrection, all right? A violent revolt or rebellion against the authorities as such, all right? When you burn a police precinct, you do not protest against the actions of a few cops. No. What you're doing is expelling the cops from your neighborhood. And since in a civilized society, the state should have the monopoly on the legal use of force, you're basically rejecting the authority and legitimacy of the state which operates the police force. This insurrection is most unlikely to remove Trump from office. Hence, it is not a coup or revolution. But the anti-Trump faction of the ruling elites have now clearly adopted the strategy of worse is better, simply because they realize that these riots are probably their last chance to blame it all on Trump and maybe, just maybe, defeat him in November. Right now, all we see can only be called a mob rule. But mobs, no matter how violent, rarely succeed in achieving tangible political results as they act against something and not for something. This is why the real ruling class needs to instrumentalize this mob-induced insurrection to their political advantage. And so far, I would say that neither the Democrats or the Republicans have succeeded in this. But there is a very long and potentially extremely dangerous summer ahead, and this might well change. Irrespective of whether either faction will succeed in instrumentalizing the riots, what we are seeing today is a systemic collapse of the U.S. society. That is not to say that the U.S. will disappear, not at all. But just like it took the Soviet Union a decade or more to fully collapse, and that was roughly from 83 to 93, it will take the U.S. many years to fully crash. And just like the new Russia eventually began taking form in, around 1999? There will be a new U.S. coming out of the current collapse. Total and final collapses are very rare. Mostly they just initiate a lengthy and potentially very dangerous transformation process, the outcome of which is almost impossible to predict. However, just as the Russian people had to stop kidding themselves with silly dreams about democracy and had to tackle the real problems of Russia, so will the people of the U.S. have to find the courage to deal with their real problems, frontally and deliberately. If they fail to do that, the country will most likely simply further disintegrate into numerous and mutual hostile entities. And time's going to tell. But, I went over my time. I've been trying to keep these for about 10 or 11 minutes. So, if I happen to get anybody watching, then they, they'll get a takeaway from this. But it's not too overpowering, you know what I mean? So I'm not, just railing away at you for a while. So, look, if you got a hold of this, if you liked it, I would love a subscription. If you hit that button, you'll be the very first one. And again, if you want to hear just the audio, thepodcast.com. You can catch us on Spotify, Apple iTunes, everywhere. We're everywhere. So that's it. I can't thank you guys enough for hanging out with me. I'm getting my outro ready. And you know what? We're going to catch you next time. Thanks.
Hey, thanks for listening. This is Madison, and I just wanted to remind you that you can also keep up with the podcast on Spotify, TuneIn, Amazon Alexa, and Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch with us, send us an email at theofficialpodcasts@gmail.com. Send us your topic ideas, questions you have, or just random thoughts that you'd like us to comment on. Again, thanks for listening. Talk soon. Bye.
That is a good soda biscuit.